Welcome into the Dreamsphere. I'm your storyteller, Emily Goodwin, and today I will be telling you the tragic tale of the Aberfan disaster. This is an extremely sad historical event, although from it came mysterious stories of prophetic dreams and premonitions claiming to have foreseen the calamity up to 2 weeks before it's happening. If death is a trigger for you, which I'm sure it's probably a trigger for everybody. Specifically, though, the death of children. And if you would just like to hear the prophetic dreams regarding this story, I shall put this timestamp you can skip ahead to in the show notes. The time is 7:30 a.m. on Friday, October 21st, 1966. Welsh mine workers arrive on site at spoil tip number 7 above Aberfan village, Wales, UK. A spoil tip, in case you don't know, is the dirt and waste dug up and collected as part of the mining process. And there were many of these spoil tips around Wales in this time, and still are to this day. They noticed that the excavated mound had sunk around 10 feet overnight and slowly was collapsing into the natural spring beneath it due to lots of rain beforehand. There were no phone lines on the hillside at that time, and so one of the workers was sent down the mountain to relay the issue to the manager. By this time, around 9 a.m., the tip had sunk another 19.5 feet due to the continued waste being added that morning. Down the village, below the spoil tip, the bell signaling the beginning of class had just rung at the Pentaglass Junior School. The mood was excited and carefree amongst the 240 students and teachers, as this was the last day before half-term. At 9:15 a.m., tragedy struck. The spoil tip gave way, and 150,000 tons of liquefied rubble slid down the mountainside towards Aberfan. Now, if you're anything like me, I can't even imagine what 150,000 tons looks like. For reference, a blue whale weighs roughly around 100 tons. So if you can picture in your mind's eye 1,500 blue whales flopping down the mountain, that's roughly how large and chaotic the mudslide would have been. I know this story is not funny. However, for my own mental stability, I have to throw in a bit of comedic relief in there to lighten the mood, because it only goes downhill from here. Survivors described the sound as if a jet plane were about to crash right above them. Those close to the windows saw a black, billowing mass crashing towards them. There was no time to react, only watch as the slurry hit the school and surrounding houses, burying everything in its path. A chilling silence swept through the village once the avalanche had stopped, and then complete pandemonium erupted. Emergency workers were called, and as they and other volunteers arrived, they began to dig. Miners, policemen, firemen, and local villagers dug with their bare hands at first, desperately trying to remove the rubble to save students and teachers. The last survivor, 8-year-old Jeff Edwards, was pulled from the rubble around 11 a.m. There had been 9 other children rescued, and after midday, no other survivors were found. 28 teachers and 116 children were killed that day. It truly was a horrible disaster. The scars of that day will stay with those families, friends, and loved ones forever, and I hope that telling their story again will let them know that we still remember. Among the volunteer team who arrived on the scene was 42-year-old psychiatrist John Barker. He supported the families by listening to them, helping them cope with the mental stress and anguish that had befallen them that day. He was intrigued when many of the families spoke of dreams and premonitions they had had leading up to the disaster. Being a member of Britain's Society for Psychical Research, founded in 1882 to investigate paranormal occurrences, he recorded the dreams and premonitions as part of a study, deciding to write a column in London's Evening Standard newspaper asking if anyone had had a genuine premonition before the coal tip fell on Aberfan. On October 28, 1966, a week after the disaster, it was published, and over the next few weeks he received a whopping 76 replies to the Aberfan appeal. For research purposes, he asked the submittants if they could corroborate their stories, from which he only received 21 respondents. I'll read for you the dreams and premonitions I was able to find. Quote from magster.com. Mrs. Grace Eagleton from Sidcup, Kent, states, I have never been to Wales, nor do I possess a television set. 1 week before the disaster, I had a vivid, horrible dream of a terrible disaster in a coal mining village. It was a valley with a big building filled with young children. Mountains of coal and water were rushed down the valley, burying the building. The screams of the children were so vivid that I screamed myself, waking myself up from my sleep. Everything all happened so quickly. Then it all went black. Quote from isjadmu.wordpress.com, a blog. 2 nights before the Aberfan landslide struck, an older man from northwest England had a dream that he was looking at a television screen. As he watched, the letters ABERFAN spelled out in front of him. He claimed that he had never heard of Aberfan before until hearing about it on the news a few days later. Quotes from 67notout.com. Sybil from Brighton had a nightmare about a child in a telephone booth screaming and a child walking towards her with a black billowing mass following behind him. Quote from whitecrowsbooks.com. Case 1. This case involved clairvoyance and or clairaudience and was a vision, not a dream. Mrs. Constance Milder, aged 47, of Trevin Gardens, Plymouth, wrote, I actually saw this disaster the night before it happened, and the next day I had already told my next-door neighbor about it before the news was broadcast. First, I saw an old schoolhouse nestling in a valley. Then a Welsh miner, then an avalanche of coal hurtling down a mountainside. At the bottom of this mountain of hurtling coal was a little boy with a long fringe. Fringe is the British term for bangs for your hair, just in case you don't know, looking absolutely terrified to death. Then for a while I saw rescue operations take place. I had an impression that the little boy was left behind and saved. He looked so grief-stricken I could never forget him, and also with him was one of the rescue workers wearing an unusually peaked cap. Mrs. C.M. described her vision as a private circle meeting held in a church on October 20th, 1966, a day before the disaster. This was confirmed, written by 6 witnesses, and Mrs. C.M.'s neighbor testified that Mrs. C.M. informed her of her vision at 8:30 a.m. on October 21st, 45 minutes before the actual disaster. Mrs. C.M. continued, Now this is probably stranger still. Whilst looking at the mountain that moved on television on Sunday evening, I saw both the terrified little boy talking to a reporter and also the rescuer I had seen in my vision. Of course, it was not until I heard the tragic news that the full force of what I had seen came to me. It took me quite a while to get over the shock. This is not the first time I have foreseen events before they have occurred, although the Aberfan disaster was the most outstanding. Case 2. Mrs. Mary Hennessy, aged 54, from Barnstaple, North Devon, wrote, The night before Aberfan disaster, I dreamt of a lot of children in 2 rooms. After a while, some of the children joined some of the others in an oblong-shaped room and were in different little groups. At the end of the room, there was a long pieces of wood or wooden bars. The children were trying somehow to get over the top or through the bars. I tried to warn someone by calling out, but before I could do so, one little child just slipped out of sight. I myself was not in either of the rooms, but was watching from the corridor. The next in my dream was hundreds of people all running to the same place. The look on people's faces was terrible. Some were crying and others holding handkerchiefs to their faces. It frightened me so much that it woke me up. I wanted to get out of bed and telephone my son and his wife and ask them to take special care of my 2 little granddaughters. When I did get up, it was 6:45 a.m. I told my brother-in-law that I had had this terrible dream and that I was going to telephone my son and daughter-in-law, but he said it was too early, and therefore I waited until 8:45 a.m. and telephoned, telling them about my dream and that I was very worried as the dream was about children. I told them it wasn't our 2 little girls in the dream, as they looked more like school children. The dream upset me very much all day, and I did not hear about the Aberfan disaster until 5:15 p.m. that evening. Quote from the NewYorker.com. On the eve of the disaster, an 8-year-old boy named Paul Davies had drawn a picture of massed dark figures digging in this hillside under the words, "The End." He had shown this picture to his parents, who had been very disturbed by it. Davies sadly died in the landslide at school that day. Lastly, and the most well-known precognitive dream was had by 10-year-old Earl May Jones, who too was claimed by the landslide. This quote is also from whitecrowsbooks.com. A fortnight before the disaster, Earl said to her mother, "Mommy, I'm not afraid to die." Her mother replied, "Why do you talk of dying? And you, so young? Do you want a lollipop?" "No," she said, "but I shall be with Peter and June," a couple of her schoolmates. The day before the disaster, she said to her mother, "Mummy, let me tell you about my dream last night." Her mother answered gently, "Darling, I've no time now. Tell me again later." The child replied, "No, Mummy, you must listen. I dreamt I went to school and there was no school there. Something black had come down all over it." Her mother dismissed her, and the next day she went off to school as usual in her normal, happy manner. Unfortunately, we know the ending to this story, and I can only imagine the horror that mother felt after hearing the news. I was so blown away by these stories and the Aberfan disaster as a whole. It's tragic, it's chilling, it's a parent's worst nightmare. I hope this story didn't dampen your spirits too much and left you feeling more interested and thoughtful than down in the dumps. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this topic, and I'd like to know if you've ever had premonitions, visions, or dreams about something that came true the next day, week, or month, maybe even a year afterwards. Let me know. Send me an email at intothedreamsphere@gmail.com, or you can find me on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. If you have any requests for stories you'd like to hear next, give me a shout. Until the next time, dream on, dreamers.